In the gilded cage of New York's underworld, Aleandro Duca was a king who spoke a language no one else dared to learn. They called him the ghost, a man who moved through the city's veins like a phantom. His power absolute, his thoughts locked behind a wall of Sicilian dialect. To his men, he was a commander. To his enemies, a nightmare. But to everyone, he was an enigma, a puzzle of cold fury and unspoken sorrow. They saw the steel in his eyes, but never the story behind it. For years, no one got close. No one understood him until a quiet waitress clearing plates in the corner of his favorite restaurant heard his whispered, frustrated curse and replied, "Aleandro Duca." The dawn of the formidable Duca crime family did not enjoy dining in public. It was a performance. Every gesture, every sip of wine, every cold glance was scrutinized by friends and foes alike. He sat in a secluded alcove at Ristorante Bellucci, an establishment his family had owned for generations. The dark mahogany and blood-red upholstery a fitting backdrop for his reign. Across from him, two American associates developers named Harris and Thorne perspired in their expensive suits, their smiles as flimsy as their promises. They were talking about zoning permits and union kickbacks, but their English was a blunt instrument grating on Aleandro's ears. He understood them perfectly, his command of the language flawless, but he chose to filter their words through his conciliary Lorenzo, who sat impassively at his side. It was a power play. Forcing them to speak through a third party reminded them of their station. They were outsiders. And so with the Port Authority on our side, the timeline is airtight, Harris concluded, beaming with a salesman's greasy confidence. Aleandro leaned back, his custom-tailored suit not creasing an inch. His eyes, the color of storm clouds over the Mediterranean, narrowed à ordiz, and spoke to Lorenzo in a low Sicilian dialect, a language of coiled vapors and ancient oaths. They understand nothing of real power, Lorenzo. They think it's bought with money and fake smiles. They are mice gnawing at the foundation of a palace, unaware of the lions sleeping inside. Lorenzo nodded, his face a granite mask. "The dawn is considering your timeline," he translated blandly for the Americans. Thorne, the more nervous of the two, decided to interject, attempting to show his cultural sensitivity. "Please tell Mr. Duca we have the utmost respect for his traditions." Alessandro's lip curled in a sneer so faint it was almost invisible. The man's condescension was an insult. The deal felt sour. He was about to dismiss them when his frustration boiled over. He gestured dismissively with one hand, his heavy gold ring glinting in the dim light, and muttered under his breath a complex, bitter phrase from his childhood in Palmoise. What a nuisance! These clowns make me want to burn their contracts and their houses. It wasn't meant for anyone but himself. A fleeting thought-given voice. Harrison and Thorne looked confused. Even Lorenzo merely registered it as a sign of his boss's displeasure. But then a sound cut through the tension, a soft, feminine voice from just behind his shoulder. "Sometimes burning everything is the only sensible answer, sir. But the ash gets expensive suits dirty." The world stopped. Aleandro froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The dialect was perfect, not just the words, but the cadence, the weary cynicism, the faint, almost lost accent of the old country. He turned his head slowly, deliberately. Standing there was a waitress. She couldn't have been more than 25, with tired but intelligent eyes, the color of warm honey, and dark hair pulled back in a simple, severe ponytail, her name tag red. She held a tray of empty glasses, her expression studiously neutral, as if she had just commented on the weather. Silence descended upon the table. Harris and Thorne looked on clueless. Lorenzo's eyes widened, a flicker of shock finally breaking his composure. Aleandro stared at her. He had seen her before 12 times. She was part of the restaurant's scenery, quiet, efficient, invisible. He had never once given her a second thought. Now she was the only thing in the universe that mattered. Who was she? How could this simple American waitress in this New York restaurant speak the language of his soul, a language he used to insulate himself from the world? He didn't speak to her. He didn't have to. His eyes bored into hers, asking 1,000 questions at once. The most important one was simple, yet deadly. Are you a threat? She met his gaze without flinching, a flicker of something. Defiance, fear, understanding. In their depths, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging his unspoken question, and then turned to clear the glasses from the adjacent empty table. Her movements were calm, measured, betraying none of the seismic shock she had just unleashed. The lion was awake, and he had just found the most perplexing creature in his entire kingdom. The air in the alcove grew thick enough to drown in. Aleandro held up a single imperious finger. Harrison and Thorne, who had been babbling nervously, fell silent. Lorenzo. Aleandro's voice was dangerously soft, the English words precise and cold. The meeting is over. Show our guests out. But Mr. Duca, the contract Harris began, his face paling. Out, Aleandro repeated, his gaze never leaving the waitress as she moved with quiet grace through the dining room. Lorenzo, ever the professional, rose smoothly. Gentlemen, this way. He herded the flustered developers away, leaving Alessandro alone in the sudden ringing silence. He watched Elara. She didn't look back. She continued her duties, wiping down a table, collecting a bill, her focus absolute. She was trying to become invisible again. It was too late. She had lit a beacon in his world of shadows. He waited. He was a patient man, a hunter by nature. He observed her for another 10 minutes. She was efficient, her movements economical. There was a subtle weariness in her posture, but a strength in her hands. Nothing about her screamed spy or assassin. She looked ordinary, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Finally, he signaled the metro, a man named Julian, who had served his father before him. Julian skewered over his face, etched with anxiety. The waitress, Elara. Aleandro set his voice a low rumble. Bring her to my private office now. Julian's eyes widened in fear. For the girl. A summons to the Don's office was never a social call. He nodded quickly and intercepted Ara near the kitchen doors, whispering the command. Aleandro watched as a wave of apprehension washed over her face, quickly masked by a placid calm. She handed her tray to another waiter, untied her apron, and followed Julian towards the back of the restaurant. The office was behind a door marked private. It was a stark contrast to the restaurant's opulence. It was a room of function and power, a large desk of dark wood, a single leather chair for him, and 2 simpler ones for visitors or victims. The walls were lined with old books, their spines cracked. The only personal touch was a framed, faded photograph on the desk of a stern-looking man and a side woman, his parents. When Ara entered, Julian closing the door softly behind her, she stood before the desk, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked small in the imposing room, but she wasn't cowering. Alessandro remained seated, steepling his fingers. He gestured to one of the chairs. She ignored it, choosing to stand. A small act of defiance. He appreciated it. He began in Italian, the same Sicilian dialect as before. Accomodati, sit down. Preferisco stare in piedi grazia. I prefer to stand. Thank you. Her reply was quiet, but firm. He switched to English. Where did you learn it? I had a good tutor. She answered, her voice even. A tutor for a dialect spoken in a handful of villages outside Palermo. A dialect most Italians don't even understand. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Right, again. Ara's gaze flickered to the photograph on his desk before meeting his eyes again. My grandmother was from Corleo. She never learned English. If I wanted to speak to her, I had to speak her language. It was a plausible lie, believable even. But Aleandro's entire life was built on deciphering lies. There was a truth in her words, but it wasn't the whole truth. It was a carefully constructed wall. Your grandmother, he mused, tapping a long finger on his desk. And your name is Vance, a good Irish or English name, not a hint of the Sicilian sun in it. My father's sighed, she said simply. The wall was holding. He studied her, truly looked at her for the first time. The weariness in her eyes wasn't just from a long shift. It was deeper, older. This was a woman who knew what it was to struggle to survive. He found himself inexplicably drawn to the strength he saw veiled behind her quiet exterior. I have a proposition for you, he said, changing tactics. I am involved in certain negotiations with parties who, like me, prefer to speak in our native tongue. My regular translator is unavailable indefinitely. The subtext was clear. The man was likely at the bottom of the East River. I'm a waitress, Mr. Duca, not a translator. You are a woman who speaks a dead language in a city of millions. That makes you a specialist, he counted. The work would require absolute discretion. It would also be lucrative enough to ensure you never have to clear another table again. He saw the flicker in her eyes. The mention of money had hit its mark. He had researched her the moment she'd left the dining room. Lorenzo had been ruthlessly efficient. R. Vance, 26 years old, lived in a small, run-down apartment in Queens, worked 2 jobs no family listed on any official documents. An orphan. Clean record. Too clean. Why me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You have 100 men who could do this. My men understand loyalty. They understand orders. They do not understand nuance, he said, his voice lowering with a startling intimacy. You do. I heard it in your reply. The ash gets expensive suits dirty. That wasn't a translation. It was a commentary, an understanding. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. He was a tall man, and his presence was overwhelming. She had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. He could smell the faint scent of coffee and lemon from her shift, a scent of honest work that was utterly alien in his world. I will pay you $50,000 for 1 week of your time. You will be my shadow. You will listen. And when I ask you, will tell me, not just what is said, but what is meant. No one will know your purpose. They will assume you are my new personal assistant. $50,000 to Ara. It was a lifeline. It was a way out of the crushing debt left by medical bills for a grandmother who had passed 2 years ago. It was freedom, but she knew instinctively that this freedom came with a cage of its own, a gilded one perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. And if I refuse? She asked. Her heart hammering against her ribs, Aleandro smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. No one has ever refused me, Elara. But I find myself hoping you'll be the first. It would be interesting. His words were a challenge, but also a threat veiled in curiosity. He was testing her, pushing her. He wanted to see if the woman who had dared to speak his language had the courage to navigate his world. Ara's mind raced. This man was a killer. The stories about him were whispered in every corner of the city. To enter his world was to risk never leaving it. But to refuse to return to her life of quiet desperation, now that he had seen her, now that he knew her secret, that felt like a different kind of death sentence. She took a deep breath, the scent of old leather, and his expensive cologne filling her lungs. She made her choice. Where do I start? The next morning, a black car, so sleek it seemed to absorb the light, was waiting for Elara outside her dilapidated Queen's apartment building. The driver, a mountain of a man in a dark suit, didn't speak, merely holding the door open for her. As she slid onto the buttery leather of the back seat, she felt as though she were crossing a threshold into another realm. The world of cracked pavement and sirens faded behind her, replaced by tinted windows and silent humming power. The car took her not to an office building, but to a sprawling mansion in a secluded, wealthy enclave of Long Island overlooking the slate-gray waters of the Sound. It was less a house and more a fortress surrounded by a high stone wall, topped with wrought iron. Guards, armed and alert, patrolled the manicured grounds. This wasn't just a home. It was the seat of an empire. She was led inside by a severe-looking woman who introduced herself as Sophia, the head of the household staff. The interior was a breathtaking display of wealth and taste. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, priceless art on the walls. Yet it felt cold, sterile, like a museum. It was a house, but not a home. Sophia showed her to a suite of rooms that was larger than her entire apartment. It was beautifully furnished, with a walk-in closet already stocked with designer clothes in her size. A silent, terrifyingly efficient act of possession. They knew her measurements. They had prepared for her arrival. On a small desk sat a brand-new laptop and a burner phone. "Mr. Duca will see you in his study in 1 hour." Sophia said, her tone leaving no room for questions, and left. Alone. Elara walked to the large window. Below, a man stood by a stark, leafless rose garden, speaking into his phone. He was powerfully built with a hard as watchful face. He saw her in the window, and his eyes narrowed with undisguised suspicion. This, she would later learn, was Marco Alejandro's underboss, and his most trusted, most dangerous man. To him, she was an anomaly, a variable in a perfectly controlled equation, and therefore a threat. An hour later, she was escorted to Aleandro's study. It was different from the office at the restaurant. This room was his heart. Dark wood shelves crammed with books in Italian and English lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a warm glow on the room. Aleandro sat in a deep leather armchair not behind a desk, holding a glass of amber liquid. He gestured for her to sit in the armchair opposite him. Today, he was dressed in a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers. Without the armor of his suit, he looked younger, but no less formidable. The power wasn't in his clothes. It was in his stillness, in the predatory grace of his movements. "Welcome to my home, Ara," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Did you sleep well?" "It's hard to sleep when you feel like you've been bored," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. A flicker of something amusement respect crossed his face. "You were not bought. You were hired. There is a difference." "Is there a purchase is permanent?" he said, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Your employment is for 1 week, unless, of course, you prove indispensable." Before she could respond, the door opened and Marco entered. He nodded curtly to Alessandro, his gaze sliding over Elara with cold appraisal. "They are here," Marco said in Italian. "Let them wait," Aleandro replied, not taking his eyes off. Marco's jaw tightened, but he left without another word. "Today you will simply listen," Alessandro explained. "I am meeting with the Calabrian faction. They wish to discuss the distribution routes in the southern burr. They are emotional people, prone to grand gestures and hidden meanings. Your grandmother was from Sicily. She must have taught you that what a man says is only the shadow of what he means. She taught me to trust no one, R said quietly. Alessandra's lips twitched in a ghost of a smile. A wise woman. The meeting took place in a formal conference room. Ara sat in a chair slightly behind and to the side of Alessandro, a notepad and pen in her hands, playing the part of the beautiful assistant. The three Calabrian men were older, with weathered faces and flashy suits. They greeted Alessandro with elaborate displays of respect that felt oily and insincere. They spoke for an hour, their dialect thick and theatrical. They postured, they flattered, they made veiled threats dressed up as friendly warnings. They spoke of family honor and mutual respect, but the words they were really saying were territory, money, and power. Ada listened, her pen still. She wasn't taking notes on their words, but on their inflections, their hesitations, the way their eyes darted to their leader, a man named Fabri, before they spoke. Alessandro remained mostly silent, a marble statue of impassivity, letting them talk themselves into circles. Finally, Fabri leaned forward, spreading his hands in a gesture of magnanimity. Alessandro, we are old friends. Our families go back. All we ask for is a sign of your trust. Give us Brooklyn. Let us manage the port. We will ensure your interests are protected and your profits will double. Alessandra turned his head slightly toward Ara. His face was unreadable. Chenepensi, what do you think? He asked softly. All eyes in the room swiveled to her. The Calabrians looked confused, then dismissive. Who was this girl? R's heart pounded, but her voice was steady as she replied in clear, formal Italian. Not dialect. Mr. Fabri speaks of doubling your profits, but he only mentions the port. He has not mentioned the unions, the sanitation contracts, or the trucking logistics, which are all currently under your control. He is not asking for a piece of the pie, Mr. Duca. He is asking for the entire bakery and offering to sell you back a single loaf of bread. A stunned silence filled the room. Faber's jovial mask dropped, revealing a flash of raw fury. He had been exposed. His greed laid bare not by the dawn, but by this slip of a girl. Then something else happened. As Fabri glared at her, another of his men, a younger one named Saul, looked at Ara with a strange, intense recognition. It wasn't a look of lust or anger. It was something else. A flicker of shock, a dawning horror, as if he were seeing a ghost. He quickly masked it, but Ara saw it. And more importantly, Alessandro, who missed nothing, saw it too. Alessandro turned back to the Calabrians, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. It was the most terrifying expression had ever seen. My assistant is wise, he said in flawless, chilling Italian. The bakery is not for sale. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Marco will show you out, and I suggest you think very carefully about your next proposal. The price of bread in this city has just gone up. The Calabrians left their bluster gone, replaced by a sullen, simmering rage. As S passed, his eyes darted to her once more, full of a fear she couldn't comprehend. When they were alone, Alessandra walked to the window looking out at the gray water. You did well, he said, his back to her. But you did more than analyze a business deal. You unsettled them, one of them in particular, the young one, S. He turned to face her, his eyes pinning her in place. He looked at you as if he knew you, as if you were someone you are not supposed to be. The air crackled with suspicion. Her carefully constructed wall had just developed a hairline fracture. I have no idea what you're talking about. She lied, her voice impressively calm. Don't you? Alessandre walked towards her, his presence of physical force. In my world, there are no coincidences, Ara, only secrets. And I find I am suddenly very, very interested in yours. The incident with the Calabrians shifted something between them. Alessandro's curiosity about intensified, transforming from a professional interest into a personal obsession. He began to keep her close, not just for meetings, but for the quiet hours in between. He would summon her to his study under the pretense of discussing business, but the conversations would invariably drift. He asked about the books she read, the music she liked, her thoughts on the art that filled his cold mansion. He was probing, searching for the person behind the heir persona. She answered carefully, offering glimpses, but never the whole picture. Like a moon revealing only a sliver of itself from behind the clouds. One evening, he dismissed his staff early and announced that he would be cooking dinner. He led her to a vast professional-grade kitchen that looked as if it had never been used. To her surprise, he moved with an easy, practiced familiarity, chopping vegetables, searing meat, his large hands surprisingly deft. "My mother taught me," he said, catching her look of surprise. She said, "A man who cannot feed himself is at the mercy of others." It was one of the few useful things she ever taught me. There was a bitterness in his tone that piqued her curiosity. "You weren't close." "My mother was not built for this life." He set his focus on the sizzling pan. "She was the daughter of a Florentine banker, married to my father to secure an alliance. She loved art and poetry. She found herself in a world of violence and fear. It broke her." He paused, his voice dropping. "She died when I was 16. It was the most personal thing he had ever revealed, a crack in his own formidable facade. Elara felt an unexpected pang of empathy for the boy he must have been alone in this brutal world. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shrugged, turning to plate the food. Sorrow is a useless emotion. They ate in a small, private dining room, the silence between them comfortable. He asked her about her grandmother, and she found herself telling him stories, real stories of the old woman's stubbornness, her superstitions, her surprisingly sharp wit. She spoke of learning to cook at her side, the scent of garlic and basil, the feel of kneading dough. For a moment, she forgot who he was and who she was pretending to be. She was just a woman sharing a memory with a man. "You miss her." He stated, his voice gentle. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Every day he reached across the table, his fingers lightly brushing hers. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that shot up her arm. It was not the touch of a boss or a captor. It was something else, something dangerously human. She pulled her hand back as if burned. The spell was broken. She remembered the gilded cage, the armed guards, the man he was. Meanwhile, Marco's distrust of Ara had festered into active investigation. He saw the Don's growing fascination with her and viewed it as a weakness, a potential vulnerability for the entire family. He couldn't understand why Aleandro, a man who trusted no one, had placed this unknown woman at the heart of his operations. Marco was a man who believed in facts, in data, in leverage, and Vance had a file that was too thin. He used the family's extensive resources, calling in favors from contacts deep within city and federal agencies. He wanted everything: school records, medical history, tax returns. He found her birth certificate. Elara Vance, born in New York Presbyterian Hospital. He found her social security number issued 3 days after her birth. He found school records from a public school in the Bronx. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. A life with no anomalies, no oddities. It was the life of a ghost, but a different kind of ghost than Alessandro. Hers was a life designed not to be noticed. Frustrated, Marco widened his search. He ran her photograph through advanced facial recognition software, cross-referencing it not with criminal databases, but with old society pages, newspapers, and international records from the past 2 decades. For days, the system churned, finding nothing. And then he got a hit. It was a grainy photograph from a 20-year-old article in an Italian newspaper, La Repubblica. The article was about a tragic car accident outside of Rome. The headline read, "Capo of Falcone family, wife and daughter perish in fiery crash." The photo showed the Falcone family at a charity event a few months before the accident. There was the Don Antonio Falcone, a man known for his cruelty and ambition. There was his beautiful wife, Isabella, and standing between them, a small girl of about 6 or 7, with large, dark, serious eyes and hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Marco zoomed in on the child's face. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, the subtle curve of her lips. It was her. It was Elara. He did more digging. The Duca family and the Falcone family had been bitter rivals. The war between them had been bloody and legendary, ending only with the accident that wiped out the Falcone leadership. The architect of that victory had been Alessandro's father, the old Don Enzo Duca. Marco felt sick. The woman who was sleeping under their roof, who was sharing meals with their Don, who was listening to their most intimate secrets, was Kiara Falcone, the sole surviving heir of their greatest enemy, an enemy Alessandro's own father had annihilated. He sprinted from his office, his heart hammering in his chest. He found Aleandro in the library, reading by the fire, a rare moment of peace on his face. R was not with him. "Don!" Marco said, his voice ragged, out of breath. "He never used such a formal title when they were alone." Alessandro looked up, his brow furrowing at his underboss's panicked state. "Marco, what is it?" Marco didn't speak. He simply placed the tablet on the table in front of Aleandro. On the screen was the grainy newspaper photograph, zoomed in on the face of the little girl. Beside it, he had placed a current candid photo of Ara he had taken in the garden. The resemblance was undeniable. The ghost had a name. Alessandro stared at the screen, his face draining of all color. The warmth from the fire seemed to recede, plunging the room into an icy cold. The woman he had been drawn to, the woman with the sad, knowing eyes, the woman who spoke his mother tongue, was the living embodiment of his family's most brutal legacy. Every moment they had shared, every conversation, every shared glance was instantly recast in a new, sinister light. Was it all a lie? Was she here for revenge? Had he, the most paranoid and guarded of men, personally invited his executioner into his home? The sense of betrayal was a physical blow so sharp and stunning it took his breath away. He had allowed a Falcone to get close to him. He had almost trusted her. He looked up at Marco, his eyes no longer the color of a storm, but of black, polished stone. "Find her," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "Bring her to me now." Elara, or Kiara, as the world once knew her, was in the mansion's vast, silent garden. She often came here when she needed to think, the scent of damp earth and late autumn roses calming the storm inside her. She knew this couldn't last. The way Alessandro looked at her, the way she felt her own carefully constructed defenses crumbling around him. It was a dangerous, intoxicating dance on the edge of a cliff. She had survived for 20 years by being invisible, but with him, she had never felt more seen. She heard the crunch of gravel behind her and turned, expecting to see Aleandro. Instead, it was Marco, flanked by 2 other guards. Marco's face was a mask of cold fury, his hand resting on the holstered weapon beneath his jacket. "The Don wants to see you," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. It was an order, not a request. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. This was it. The moment she had dreaded for 2 decades, they knew. She didn't resist. As they escorted her back inside, their presence on either side of her, a clear message. She was now a prisoner. They didn't take her to the study or the library. They led her down a flight of stone stairs into the mansion's subtle to a room she had never seen before. It was a wine cellar, the walls lined with priceless vintages. In the center of the room was a single heavy wooden table and 2 chairs. It was cold, the air thick with the smell of earth and aged wine. Alessandro was waiting. He stood in the shadows, his face unreadable. The warmth she had seen in him over the past few days was gone, replaced by an Arctic chill that was more terrifying than any overt rage. He gestured for his men to leave. Marco hesitated, his eyes fixed on Ara with venomous distrust. "Vai," Aleandro commanded without looking at him. "Go!" The heavy oak door banged shut, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the cellar. They were alone. He stepped out of the shadows holding a tablet. He placed it on the table without a word. On the screen was the article, the grainy photo, her family, her face, her past. She looked at the image of the smiling little girl she once was. A ghost from another life. The life that had been stolen from her. She felt a wave of grief so profound it almost buckled her knees, but she stood her ground, her spine rigid. "I have been called many things in my life." Aleandro's voice was unnervingly calm, a low vibration in the silent room. "Fool has never been one of them until today." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. 20 years. 20 years you have been a ghost. Why come back now? Why here? Revenge? To finish the war my father started. The accusation hung in the air between them. Revenge. It was what he would have done. It was the logic of his world. You think I spent 20 years hiding, scrubbing floors, and serving men like you just so I could— What? Poison. Your soup. Her voice was laced with a bittersweetness that surprised even her. The fear was receding, replaced by a surge of long-suppressed anger. You credit me with far too much ambition, Mr. Duca. Then why, he demanded, slamming his hand on the table, the sound making the wine bottles rattle on their racks. Why walk into the heart of your enemy's camp, speaking his language? It wasn't a plan, she shot back, her voice rising. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. I heard you speak, and for 1 second I forgot to be afraid. For 1 second, I heard the language of my grandmother, and I felt homesick. The confession came out as a raw, painful whisper. He stared at her, the fury in his eyes, roaring with a flicker of something else. Confusion. Doubt. My name, she said, her voice dropping heavy with the weight of the words she hadn't spoken aloud in 2 decades, is Kiara Falcone. Your father, Enzo Duca, killed my parents. He ran my mother's car off a cliffside road outside Rome. He staged it to look like an accident. I was in the car. Aleandro flinched as if she had struck him. He knew his father was a ruthless man. But he had always believed the official story about the Falconese. I was thrown clear. She continued, her gaze distant, lost in the horror of the memory. I was 7 years old. I hid in the woods, injured, and watched. I watched as one of your father's men walked down to the wreckage to make sure the job was done. I learned that day that the only way to survive is to be no one, to be forgotten. She took a shaky breath. A distant cousin of my mother, a baker with no ties to the family, found me. He smuggled me to America. He gave me a new name, a new history. He raised me until he died. My grandmother. My mother's mother came later. We had nothing. I've spent my entire life looking over my shoulder, terrified that a ghost from the past would find me. And then I found one myself. The silence in the cellar was absolute. The story was so raw, so filled with pain, it was impossible to doubt. She wasn't a trained assassin seeking vengeance. She was a survivor, haunted by a past he had inherited. Aleandro sank into one of the chairs, the formidable Don Duca suddenly looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. The sins of his father had just walked into his life, not as an enemy to be vanquished, but as the woman he had cooked dinner for, the woman whose touch had sent fire through his veins. His anger at her deception was eclipsed by a more complex, unsettling emotion. He was looking at the living consequence of his family's power. He had built his empire on a foundation of ghosts, and one of them had just come back to haunt him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice. "Tell you?" she asked with a humorless laugh. "Tell the son of the man who murdered my family that I was his long-lost enemy." "What would you have done?" Aleandro offered me an apology and a severance package. He had no answer. According to the code he lived by, he should have killed her the moment he found out. She was a Falcone. A blood debt existed between their names. But looking at her now, seeing the fierce, wounded strength in her honey-colored eyes, he knew he couldn't. The thought was a betrayal of everything. He was everything he had been taught. "Someone else knows," he said suddenly, his mind racing. The strategist in him taking over. The Calabrian Sal, he recognized you. Kiara's blood ran cold. She remembered the look in the man's eyes. It wasn't just recognition, it was reverence. "The Valentis were one of my father's most loyal families," she whispered. "Sal's father was my father's right hand." Alessandro stood up, a new, cold dread settling over him. It was no longer just about them, about their pasts. A leak of this magnitude was a death sentence. The old loyalties, the old grievances. They never truly died. They just slept, and they had just woken up. "He won't say anything to the other Calabrians," Aleandro reasoned, pacing the stone floor. "He'll go to his own people, Riccardo Valente. He'll see you as a symbol, a lost queen, a banner under which he can unite the old Falcone loyalists and challenge me." He stopped and looked at her, his expression grim. "He won't just come for me. He will come for you. To him, you are a relic to be claimed, a weapon to be used." The personal betrayal, the historical feud, it all vanished, replaced by a new, terrifying reality. Her past hadn't just found her. It was coming to drag her back into a war she had never wanted to fight, and the only person who could protect her was the one man she should have feared the most. The mansion transformed overnight. The quiet, sterile opulence was replaced by a tense, humming readiness. The number of guards on the perimeter doubled. Marco, his personal feelings for Kiara, now irrelevant in the face of an existential threat, moved with brutal efficiency, locking down all communications and fortifying their defenses. He had looked at Kiara once after Alessandro had explained the situation. A look of grudging respect for the Don's decision, mixed with his ingrained suspicion. "The enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least for now." Alessandro moved Kiara to a bedroom in the secure core of the mansion, adjacent to his own. The pretense was gone. She was no longer an employee. She was the epicenter of a coming earthquake. "Riccardo Valente is a snake," Aleandro explained, standing by her window, which now overlooked 2 guards patrolling the garden below. "He pretends to be a minor player, but he's been consolidating the remnants of the old families for years, waiting for a cause. You are his cause. He will try to take you to use me," Kiara corrected, her voice flat, "to prop me up as a figurehead while he seizes power. I am not a person to him. I am a name." To me, Alessandro said, turning to face her, his eyes intense. "You are Kiara." The use of her real name, spoken in his low, rumbling voice, sent a shiver through her. In that moment, he wasn't the son of her family's killer. He was the only person in the world who knew both her faces. The ghost named Ara, and the girl named Kiara. The wait was agonizing. For 3 days, the mansion was a pressurized container of silence and tension. Alessandro barely slept, coordinating his intelligence network, trying to anticipate Valence's move. During this time, he and Kiara existed in a strange limbo. They talked for hours, filling in the 20-year gap of their shared history from opposite sides of a bloody line. She told him about her lonely childhood, the constant fear, the quiet desperation. He told her about the crushing weight of his legacy, the isolation of being the Dawn, the man everyone feared, but no one knew. They were two sides of the same coin, both trapped by the sins of their fathers. An impossible magnetic pull grew between them, forged in the crucible of their shared danger. The attack came not with a bang, but with a whisper. Valente was smarter than to launch a frontal assault on the Duke of Fortress. He exploited a single moment of weakness. Sophia, the head of the household staff, had a son with a gambling problem. Valente's people had gotten to him, squeezed him, and forced him to place a call to his mother. He was in trouble, he'd said. He needed her. Sophia, in a moment of maternal panic, broke protocol. She left the mansion grounds in her own car to meet him. It was all Valente needed. His men were waiting. They didn't harm her. They simply took her keys and security fob. Minutes later, a catering van with the mansion's trusted supplier logo on the side drove up to the service gate. With Sophia's FOB, it passed the first layer of security. The assault was swift and brutal. Valente's men disguised as caterers swarmed out of the van, neutralizing the guards at the service entrance. An alarm blared through the mansion. Aleandro and Marco were in the war room, a high-tech command center in the basement. "They're in the West Wing," Marco yelled, watching the security feeds. Aleandro's blood ran cold. Kiara's room was in the West Wing. "Lock down the central core. Get our men to intercept. I'm going for her," Alessandro commanded, pulling a sleek black handgun from a hidden drawer in the desk. He moved through the mansion's corridors with a predator's speed and silence. He could hear the distant sounds of shouting and gunfire. When he reached the residential wing, he found 2 of his own men, down unconscious but alive. Valente's men had used tranquilizer darts. They weren't here to wipe out the Ducas. They had a single objective. He kicked open the door to Kiara's room. It was empty. The window overlooking a low stone balcony was shattered. On the floor lay a single small black dart. He was too late. A primal rage, cold and pure, surged through Aleandro. It wasn't about family honor or territory anymore. They had taken her. He grabbed his radio. "Marco, they have her. They're heading east toward the water. Get the cars. No one gets off this island." Kiara awoke with a throbbing head in the back of a moving van. Her hands were bound with a zip tie. Across from her sat Sal Valente, the young Calabrian, his face a mixture of awe and pity. Next to him was his uncle Riccardo Valente, a man with a serpent smile and cold, dead eyes. Kiara Falcone. Riccardo said, his voice smooth and oily. "It is an honor, a miracle. Your father would be proud to see you." "My father is dead." Kiara spat her head, clearing. "He was killed by the Ducas, an injustice we are about to correct." Riccardo smiled. "With you as our queen, the families loyal to the Falcone name will rise up. The Duca reign is over. We will restore what is rightfully yours." "What is rightfully yours?" "You mean?" She counted her eyes, flashing with defiance. She was not the frightened little girl who had hidden in the woods. She had survived for 20 years. She was not a pawn. "You need my name. Without it, you are nothing. Ricardo's smile tightened. You are as spirited as your mother. No matter, you will play your part. The van stopped. The doors opened to a private dock where a speedboat was waiting, its engine already rumbling. This was their escape route. As they hustled her from the van toward the boat, a screech of tires echoed from the road leading to the dock. Two black sedans, Alessandro roared into view, cutting off their escape. Men in dark suits, armed with tactical efficiency, poured out, taking cover behind the cars. Marker was one of them, leading them, walking calmly through the unfolding chaos. As if it were a storm, he commanded, was Alessandro. He held his handgun with a steady, practiced ease, his eyes fixed on Kiara, ignoring everyone else. Valente. Aleandro's voice boomed across the dock, a sound of pure, controlled fury. Let her go. This is between you and me. Ricardo laughed, grabbing Kiara and pulling her in front of him, a knife suddenly appearing in his hand, its blade pressed against her throat. She is the entire point, Duca. She that is the past and the future. Without her, you are just a common thug. With her, I am a knowing. Kiara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was sharp. She looked at Alessandro at the unshakable resolve in his eyes. He wasn't looking at Ricardo. He was looking at her. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a message. I trust you. She knew what she had to do. Ricardo was using her as a shield, but he was monologuing drunk on his own ambition. My father, Kiara said, her voice clear and strong, making Ricardo pause. He used to say, never trust a man who talks more than he fights. Then she did something no one expected. She slammed her head back hard into Ricardo's nose. There was a sickening crunch. He roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for a split second. It was all the opening they needed. Kiara drove her elbow into his ribs and dropped to the ground, rolling away. In the same instant, two sounds cracked through the air almost as one. The first was from Alessandro's gun. The second was from Marco's. Ricardo Valente fell to the ground, two red flowers blooming on his chest. His men, their leader gone, were quickly and brutally subdued. In the ringing silence that followed, Alessandro walked forward. His gun still raised, his eyes scanning for any remaining threats. When he was certain it was over, he lowered his weapon and rushed to Kiara's side. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over her, checking for injuries. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice roar with an emotion she had never heard from him before. Fear? No. She whispered, her body trembling with adrenaline. I'm okay. He reached out and with a surprising gentleness cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. In front of his men in the middle of the carnage, the untouchable Don Alessandro Duca looked at Kiara Falcone, not as a rival, not as a prize, and not as a ghost, but as the only thing in his world that he couldn't bear to lose. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her tightly against him, a desperate, possessive embrace that was both a comfort and a promise that he would never let anyone take her from him again. In the aftermath, the Duca machine moved with silent, brutal efficiency, erasing all evidence of the attack. By sunrise, the mansion was pristine, the only sign of the night's violence. A new profound stillness that settled between Alessandro and Kiara. They sat in his study, the chaos over leaving them to face the wreckage of their intertwined pasts. The threat is gone. Aleandro said, his voice low as he stared into the crackling fireplace. Valente and his loyalists have been dismantled. No one will come for you again. He turned to her, his expression as a mask of grim duty. I will give you a new life anywhere you want. Money protection, you will be safe. It was the offer of a beautiful cage, a life of comfortable exile, the same fate his mother had suffered. Kiara looked at the man before her, the fearsome Dawn, the lonely ghost, and saw not an escape route, but the only home she had ever known. "And you?" she challenged softly, rising from her chair to stand before him. "Will you go back to your silence, to a life where no one speaks your language?" Her question struck him. The thought of this house without her, of returning to the profound isolation he hadn't even recognized until she arrived, was unbearable. "We are a Falcone and a Duca." He said the words heavy with a century of blood and hate. "The sins of our father stand between us." "No," she whispered, reaching out to place her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "They are the ground beneath our feet. They are the reason we understand each other. Who else could possibly comprehend the shadows we carry?" She looked into his eyes, her own gaze unwavering. "You speak the language of my soul, Aleandro. Don't send me away to a place where I'll be silent again." His carefully constructed walls crumbled. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, his face buried in her hair. "I don't know how to build a life out of this wreckage, Kiara." He confessed, his voice roar with a vulnerability. He'd never shown another living soul. She held him tighter, a sense of peace settling over her for the first time in 20 years. "Then we'll build it together." It was not the promise of a simple life, but it was a promise of a shared one. Later, Marco found them in the kitchen. Kiara was laughing, a smudge of flour on her cheek, while Alessandro, the city's most feared man, watched her with an expression of such unguarded tenderness it took the underboss's breath away. The mansion was still a fortress, their world still steeped in shadow. But it was no longer a cold, empty castle. It was a kingdom of two. And for the first time, the ghost was not alone. The story of Aleandro and Kiara reminds us that our past doesn't have to define our future. They were born into a world of hatred, destined to be enemies, their names written in a history of violence. Yet beneath the titles of Mafia boss and lost heir, they were just two lonely souls who spoke the same language of sorrow and survival. Their journey shows us that the strongest connections are often forged in the most impossible circumstances, and the true understanding is a language more powerful than any dialect. They chose not to be ghosts of their family's wars, but to build a new legacy together, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of worlds, love can find a way to rewrite the rules. If you are captivated by the story of the ghost and his queen, please don't let this be the end of our journey together. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone else who loves a story of drama and impossible romance. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next story we have in store for you. Thank you for listening.